No one ever chose me first. She said it quietly, standing at the fence line, the September light gone gold behind her, and for the length of one breath the whole valley seemed to hold its breath around them. 6 words. No tears in them. No performance. Only a truth she had carried since she was 8 years old, laid down at last on the top rail of an old split-rail fence in the San Juan Range of southwest Colorado, on a Tuesday afternoon that had not been a Tuesday for visiting. To understand what those 6 words cost her, and what the promise that answered them meant, you have to go back. Ellie Ward was 29 years old, and she had lived every one of those years within 12 miles of the same crooked cottonwood. She had been born on the Ward homestead in the spring of 1868, the second child of Sam and Ruthie Ward, and she had lost her mother in the birthing of a brother who did not survive the winter. She was 8 years old the year her mother died, and she had learned that year that the world does not stop for a small girl's grief. It only asks her to stir the coffee, and to bring in the wood, and to press her father's shirts on Sundays. Her father Sam had lived 14 years past that loss, quiet, kind, growing thinner every winter, until pneumonia took him in the March of Ellie's 22nd year and left her the sole keeper of 40 acres of hard grazing land, 16 head of cattle, 1 milk cow named Bess, 3 laying hens, and a hope chest her mother had carved that stood at the foot of the bed nobody but Ellie had slept in for 7 years. She was not homely. That was the strange truth of it. The women at the general store in Durango would tell you Ellie Ward had a fine, quiet face, hazel green eyes that noticed things, chestnut hair that fell to her waist when she let it down at night, and a way of standing very still when she was thinking that gave her a dignity older than her years. But she was not showy, and she did not laugh loudly, and she did not know how to be the first thing anyone noticed in a room. She had watched, from the time she was 15, other girls be chosen. Prettier girls. Louder girls. The Halloran twins had been chosen at 17. Mary Beth Preston had been chosen at 19. Josiah Hardin's own younger sister had been chosen at 21, and the wedding had been the biggest thing to happen in the valley for a summer. Ellie had stood at the back of every one of those weddings in a plain forest green wool dress with a cream muslin blouse buttoned all the way to the throat, and she had smiled the half-smile that never quite finished, and she had gone home and fed the chickens. She had told no one, in all those years, that she felt herself passed over. It was not her way to complain. It was not her father's way, either, and she had taken his habits into her bones. She had made the ranch profitable in a small and honest fashion, and she had kept the fences mended, and she had learned to shoot a jackrabbit at 40 paces if the season was lean. She did not think she had been unhappy. She only thought she had not been chosen. There is a difference between the two, though most people do not learn it until they are already living inside it. Caleb Rourke was 34 years old when he came down out of the San Juan Range on a gray mare in the late August of 1897, with a saddlebag heavier than it should have been and a coat that had once been someone else's. He had grown up in Pueblo, 180 miles north and east, the youngest of 4 brothers, 3 of whom had gone into the railroads and 1 of whom had gone into the ground at Wounded Knee. He had not gone into either. He had ridden south instead at 20, and he had worked cattle for a dozen outfits between Pueblo and the New Mexico line, and he had learned that he did not want a bunkhouse life or a wife who did not know him. He had turned down, in the course of those 14 years, 3 separate proposals of marriage from women who found his silences interesting. He had told none of them the reason. The reason was that he had, since the summer he was 19, been trying to find a woman he could not read at a glance, and every woman who had asked him had been readable in the first minute. He came down into the Ward Valley because a foreman in Silverton had told him a widow's daughter was running her own place east of Durango and might hire honest labor for the fall. He did not stop at the town well. He did not stop at the church. He stopped at the fence line of the Ward place, where a section of split rail was leaning badly under the weight of the wind, and he sat his mare there and waited until the woman came out of the house. She came out with a shotgun broken open over her forearm and her hair in a low braid down her back and a cream apron over her forest green skirt, and she stopped 10 feet from him and said, "You're on my line." He said, "Yes, ma'am." She said, "Are you lost?" He said, "No, ma'am." She said, "Then why are you here?" He said, "Because your fence is leaning, and I have a hammer and I heard you might be hiring." She looked at him for a long moment. She was thinking, though he could not have known it, that in 29 years no man had ever ridden up to the Ward place and offered to fix anything before asking to be paid. She was thinking that his hands, resting on the pommel of a plain worn saddle, were the hands of a man who had held reins and hammers and nothing else for a long time. She was thinking that his eyes were the color of the creek in April when the snowmelt is running clear. She said, "There's water at the pump behind the house. Put your horse in the corral. There's cold beans on the stove. We'll talk about hiring after you've eaten." He said, "Yes, ma'am." He did not fix the fence that first afternoon. He watered the mare, and he ate the beans standing at the kitchen doorway because he would not sit down at a table he had not been asked to sit at, and he thanked her twice for the food, and then he took a hammer from his own saddlebag and he walked out to the leaning section of split rail without another word. She watched him from the kitchen window for an hour. He did not look up once. He did not perform the work. He set the broken timber straight, and he drove new nails into the good wood, and he replaced 2 rails with lengths he had cut down from a fallen cottonwood at the edge of the creek. When the sun was low, he came back to the kitchen doorway and he set his hat down brim up on the porch bench and he said, "Ma'am, the fence is straight." She said, "Thank you." And then, because she had not been able to help it, she said, "You didn't ask what I'd pay you." He said, "I didn't fix it for pay." He slept that first night in the barn, in the loft above Bess the milk cow, with his coat rolled under his head and the mare tied in the box stall below him, and Ellie Ward lay awake in her mother's bed at the north end of the house with the lantern turned low and thought about the way a stranger had walked out to her fence without asking anything, and about the fact that in 29 years no man had ever done that, and about the fact that she was not sure whether she was grateful or afraid. He stayed. She did not remember, later, exactly when it stopped being a question of whether he would stay. He mucked the corral in the morning. He drove the herd up to the high meadow before the first September frost. He rebuilt the west gate that had been sagging since her father died, and he built it heavier than it had been, and he set the hinges on the inside where the wind would not tear them loose. He asked her on the 4th day what wages would be fair, and she said $7 a month and board, and he said that was more than fair. She paid him $7 at the end of the month in silver coins she had counted twice, and he took them into town on a Saturday and came back with a new pane of glass wrapped in brown paper and a small tin of white paint. She said, "What's the glass for?" He said, "The east window of the kitchen is cracked." "I've been meaning to say." She said, "It's been cracked 4 winters. I meant to fix it myself." He said, "I know." He replaced the window that afternoon. He measured carefully, and he cut the frame back where the wood had rotted at the sill, and he set the new paint in with fresh putty, and he painted the frame white where the old paint had gone gray. He worked for 3 hours without a word. When he was done, the September afternoon light came through that window like nothing had ever been between it and her kitchen table, and Ellie Ward stood in the doorway with a rag in her hand and did not say anything for a long time. She noticed, and did not say, that he had set the pane a fraction lower than the old one had sat, so that a woman sitting at the table with her Bible open would have the morning light falling straight across the page. He said, "I set it east because the morning light will be better for reading. I noticed the Bible on the table." She said, "Thank you." That was the first thing. The second thing happened in early October, when a hard freeze came down out of the mountains 3 weeks before it had any business coming. Ellie went out to the barn at 4 in the morning because she had heard Bess bawling, and she found Caleb Rourke already there, in his shirt sleeves in the cold, with a lantern hung from the rafter and Bess's calf slick on the straw between his knees and Caleb's hand inside the cow because the calf had come sideways. He did not look up when she came in. He said only, "Warm water. As much as you can carry." And she went back to the kitchen and she put the big kettle on the stove and she carried water out to the barn in 2 enameled pails for the next hour. And by the time the sun came up there was a wet, breathing calf in the straw and a milk cow washing him with a slow pink tongue and Caleb Rourke standing at the barn door with his sleeves rolled to the shoulder and his forearms streaked to the elbow. And he said, "She'll be all right." "So will he." Ellie said, "How did you know she was in trouble?" He said, "I sleep light. I've heard her bawl at 4 in the morning 8 times since I came. This morning was different." She said, "You noticed?" He said, "Yes, ma'am." She said, "Nobody ever notices things about me." He looked at her for a long moment then. Not long enough to be uncomfortable. Long enough that she understood he had heard her. And he said only, "I do." That was the second thing. The third thing happened 3 Sundays later, at the general store in Durango. Marta Halloran, who had run the store for 18 years and had known Ellie since she was a girl with 2 long braids, was tapping her pencil against the countertop when Ellie came in, which meant Marta was about to say something Ellie did not want to hear. Marta said, "Josiah Harden was in yesterday." Ellie said, "Was he?" Marta said, "He asked after you." Ellie said, "He always asks after me." Marta said, "He's asked after you every Saturday for 6 years, Eleanor Ward, and I have never once heard you ask after him. But I will tell you something. He came in yesterday and he asked me if I thought a woman like you would consider a man like him now that she has hired hands on the place, and I told him I did not know what you would consider, but I know what I would consider, and it would not be him." Ellie said, "Marta." Marta said, "I have said my piece. I will say one more thing. That man you hired stopped by here on Friday and bought a small tin of blue-black ink and a pen nib, and I asked him what it was for, and he said it was for a woman who had lost her mother's Bible in a barn fire 14 years ago and had not been able to write in the margins of the new one because she did not want to spoil it. I did not know that about you, Eleanor." "He did." Ellie stood at the counter for a long moment with her hand on a paper sack of flour, and she said nothing. And Marta, who had raised 2 children and buried a husband and knew when to stop pushing, only nodded and rang up the flour and the coffee and a bar of yellow soap and said, "Ride safe home." That was the 3rd thing. She rode home with the ink and the pen nib wrapped in brown paper in her saddlebag, and she did not say anything about them when she got to the house, and Caleb, who was setting fence posts along the south line, did not say anything about them either. That night she wrote her mother's name in the margin of the 2nd chapter of Ruth, in a hand that was smaller and neater than she remembered her mother's being, and she cried very quietly for the first time in 11 years, and then she went to sleep. She kept the pen nib in her mother's hope chest afterwards, wrapped in the same brown paper, because some gifts belong beside the memory of the person you first wished had given them to you. Reverend Silas Coombs came out to the Ward place on the 2nd Sunday of November. He was 60 years old and thin and stooped and kind, and he rested both hands flat on Ellie's kitchen table before he spoke, which meant he was about to say a thing he had thought about carefully. He said, "Eleanor, there is talk in town." She said, "There is always talk in town, Reverend." He said, "There is talk that you have a man living in your barn." She said, "He has been living in my barn since August, Reverend, and he has not once come into this house past the kitchen doorway, and if there is talk it is not because there is anything to talk about." He said, "I know that. I know you, Eleanor Ward. I baptized you and I buried your father, and I would not sit at your table if I believed the talk. I am telling you because Josiah Harden has been in the pew every Sunday since the freeze, and he has been telling people he intends to speak to you before the first snow, and I would not want you surprised by it." She said, "Thank you, Reverend." He said, "You do not owe Josiah Harden an answer he wants. You do not owe the valley an answer at all. But I will say this. Whatever you are considering, consider it with your own heart, and not with the town's." He drank the coffee. He put both hands flat on the table again. He said, "I will not come out here again on this errand, Eleanor. I only wanted you to have the warning." That evening Ellie walked out to the west gate where Caleb was tightening a hinge, and she stood at the fence line 10 feet from him and she said, "Josiah Harden is going to come here before the snow." Caleb set his hat down brim up on a fence post. He said, "I figured he might." She said, "You don't seem worried about it." He said, "I have no right to be worried about it." She said, "That's not what I asked." He said, "You asked if I was worried. I said I have no right to be. That is my answer." She said, "Caleb Rourke." It was the first time she had said his full name to his face. He heard it. He turned his head slowly, and he looked at her the way he had looked at her in the barn the morning of the calf. And he said, "Yes, ma'am." She said, "If Josiah Harden comes here and asks me a question, what would you want me to say to him?" He said, "I would want you to say whatever is true." She said, "That is not an answer." He said, "It is the only answer I have the right to give you, Eleanor." She said, "Then you don't have any right to look at me like you're looking at me right now." And he said quietly, "I know. I have been trying not to since September." She stood at the fence line for a long moment. The November light was gone thin and gray. The cottonwoods were nearly bare. She said, "Fix the hinge. Come to the kitchen when you're finished. I have something to say and I do not want to say it out here in the cold." He said, "Yes, ma'am." She went inside and she stirred the fire up and she set 2 cups on the table because she had never, in all the months he had worked her land, set a second cup at that table. When he came in he stood at the doorway with his hat in his hands and he did not sit until she gestured to the chair, and even then he sat very carefully, as if the chair belonged to someone else. She said, "My father died 7 years ago. Since then no man has sat in that chair but you tonight. I want you to know that." He said, "I know." She said, "Josiah Hardin will offer me a good life. He has 300 acres and 40 head and a house with 2 stories and glass in every window." He said, "Yes, ma'am." She said, "I have known him since I was 6 years old and I have not once wanted him to look at me the way you look at me." He said nothing. She said, "No one ever chose me first, Caleb. Not my father, who chose my mother. Not the boys at school, who chose the Halloran twins. Not Josiah Hardin, who chose his first wife 12 years ago and only came around to me because she died and I am still here. Every man in this valley chose somebody else before he thought about me. I do not blame them. I only want to say the words out loud because I have never said them out loud before." He set his hat down on the table brim up. He said, "May I say something?" She said, "Yes." He said, "I have not chosen you first, Eleanor. I have chosen you only. There is a difference. First is a race. Only is a decision. I did not come to your fence line because I could not find another. I came because a foreman in Silverton told me a woman east of Durango was running her own place, and I rode 200 miles to see if she was the woman I had been looking for since I was 19, and by the time you came out of your house with a broken shotgun and asked me why I was on your line I already knew she was. I have known it every day since. I have not said it because I did not want to say it before you were ready to hear it. And I have not chosen anyone else in my whole life for the reason that I was waiting to be able to say what I am saying to you. Now," she said, "Caleb." He said, "I do not have 300 acres. I have $7 a month and a mare and a coat that used to be my brother's. But I will make you one promise. I will not choose another woman as long as I am alive. Not because I could not, because I would not. That is the promise. That is the only promise I have to offer you. Everything else I will build for you, one thing at a time, starting with a house that has glass in every window if you want one, and I do not need an answer tonight." She was very still for a long time. She said, "Come out to the fence line with me." They walked out into the cold together. The sky was low and gray. The cottonwoods along the creek were nearly bare, the last gold leaves clinging in 2s and 3s. She stopped at the top rail of the west gate he had rebuilt, and she rested one hand on the wood he had set with his own hands, and she said the words she had said in her mind for 21 years and had never said out loud until that Tuesday afternoon that had not been a Tuesday for visiting. She said, "No one ever chose me first." And he said, "I know. So I made one promise. Only, not first, only, for the rest of my life." She said, "Then I will make one back to you." He said, "You don't have to." She said, "I know. I want to." She said, "I will not spend another day of my life wondering whether the man across from me chose me because he could not find another. That is the promise I make to you. And I will not ask you to say pretty words because you don't have them and I don't need them, and if you fix another window in this house I will know exactly what you mean by it." He said, "Yes, ma'am." She said, "Caleb Rourke." He said, "Yes." She said, "That is what love looks like when it doesn't announce itself. It just quietly faces east." And the last of the November light went out behind the mountains, and neither one of them looked away. Josiah Hardin came on the 3rd Sunday of November, in a dark gray wool suit coat and a starched white shirt and a string tie, riding a good bay gelding, with his hat in his hand before he had crossed the yard. He was 38 years old, sandy-haired, reasonable, and he had rehearsed his words for a week. He stopped 10 feet from the porch. Ellie came out with her shawl over her shoulders and Caleb stood back at the corner of the barn where he could see them both but not close enough to interfere, and Josiah turned his hat in his hands twice, the way he always did before he asked a real question. He said, "Eleanor, I've come to say a thing you may have expected." She said, "I know, Josiah." He said, "I would offer you a good home. I would not ask you to sell this land. I would run mine and yours together for the value of both, and you would have a house with 2 stories and glass in every window, and my children would call you mother, and you would not want for anything for the rest of your life. I have thought about this for 6 years. I am asking now because it is fair to ask now, and I did not want to ask before it was fair. She said, Josiah, I have known you since I was 6 years old. He said, yes, ma'am. She said, you are a good man. You are a fair man. You will make some woman a good husband, and I hope she is a woman who will love you for the reasons you deserve to be loved for. He said, but you will not be that woman. She said, no, I will not. He was quiet for a long moment. He turned his hat in his hands a third time. That was the moment where he could have argued, where he could have offered more, where he could have said the words that would have made him small. He did not. He stood very still, and the wind moved through the cottonwoods behind him, and the color rose in his face and then went out again. When he spoke again, there was something older in his voice, something honest, and Ellie understood in that instant that Josiah Hardin had known the answer before he rode out to her yard, and had come anyway because he was the kind of man who did not let a question he had carried for 6 years go unspoken. He said, may I ask why? She said, because a man rode down out of the mountains in August and offered to fix my fence before he asked what I would pay him. Because he replaced my east window so I would have good light. Because he heard my milk cow bawl at 4 in the morning 8 times and knew the 9th was different. Because he has chosen me only. Not first. Only. And because I have chosen him back. Josiah Hardin was quiet for a long time. Then he said, that is a better answer than I had any right to hope for. I would like to shake his hand. Caleb walked out from the corner of the barn. The two men met in the middle of the yard. They did not smile. They shook hands once, firmly. Josiah said, you take care of her, Mr. Rourke. Caleb said, yes, sir. Josiah said, I mean that. She is worth taking care of. Caleb said, I know. Josiah put his hat on. He said, Eleanor, I wish you every good thing. I do not say that lightly. She said, I know you don't, Josiah. Thank you. He rode out of the yard. He did not look back. It cost him something, and Ellie saw it cost him something, and Caleb saw it too, and both of them understood that a man who lost a thing with dignity was a man who had lost only a thing. Josiah Hardin married the Preston widow the following spring, and by all accounts he loved her well, and neither of them ever spoke a word against the Rourke place. They were married in the little clapboard church in Durango on the last Sunday of April 1898, 5 months to the day after the November evening at the West Gate. Reverend Silas Coombs read the vows with both hands flat on the pulpit. Marta Halloran stood at the front pew and did not tap a pencil on anything, because for once in her life she had nothing left to say that Ellie Ward did not already know. Bess the milk cow was in the corral at home with a healthy fall calf beside her, and the east window of the kitchen was clean, and the west gate was straight, and the fence line ran unbroken from the creek to the road. Caleb built the second story on the house himself over the summer of 1898. He put glass in every window. The one that faced east was the largest. He worked most of that summer in his shirt sleeves in the long afternoon light, and Ellie brought him water from the pump twice a day, and neither of them said much about what they were building because the building said it for them. When the second story was finished, he laid the last shingle at sundown on the second Sunday of August, and he came down the ladder and he set his hat brim up on the porch bench and he said, it is done, Eleanor. And she said, I know. 12 Aprils later, on a soft green morning when the cottonwoods along the creek were just beginning to open, Eleanor Rourke stood at the top rail of the west gate her husband had built her, with 2 small children in the yard behind her and a third on the way, and she looked out at the fence line and the mountains and the light coming through the east window of her own home, and she remembered a Tuesday afternoon in September that had not been a Tuesday for visiting, and 6 words she had said out loud for the first time in her life, and one promise that had answered them, and she thought about the difference between first and only. She said it out loud to the wind. No one ever chose me first. And from the porch behind her a voice that had grown quieter and gentler over 12 years of morning light through an east-facing window said, I know. So I made one promise. Only, not first, only, for the rest of my life. She did not turn around. She only rested her hand on the wood he had set with his own hands, and she smiled the half-smile that never quite finished, and she thought about how grief learns to share the house with other things, and how love does not always announce itself, and how sometimes the whole shape of a woman's life turns on a single sentence spoken at a fence line in the September gold. She thought about her mother, and about her father, and about the 8-year-old girl who had learned that the world does not stop for a small girl's grief, and she understood at last that the girl had been wrong. Sometimes the world does stop. It just takes 21 years to notice, and it needs a fence line to stop against, and it needs a man who will not choose anyone else in order to stop for. If you are listening tonight, from wherever you are in the world, and you have ever felt yourself passed over in a room full of people who were being chosen, I want you to remember this. First is a race. Only is a decision. There is a difference between the two, and the difference is the whole difference in a life. Nobody who is worth being chosen by will ever choose you because they could not find another. They will choose you because they would not. If somebody is fixing your east window without being asked, look at them. If somebody is hearing the 8th ball of your milk cow and staying awake for the 9th, look at them. That is what love looks like when it doesn't announce itself. It just quietly faces east. Thank you for spending this hour with Ellie Ward and Caleb Rourke, and with the long light on the Ward fence line, and with the east window of a small kitchen in the San Juan Range. Until next time, keep riding. If this story stayed with you, stay with us for the next one. The tale of a widow in the November snow who fixed a stranger's broken wagon and heard him say 3 words she had waited 30 years to hear. That is the story we will tell you next.